Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing well. In today's video, I am going to be reviewing A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. Le Guin is an author who I've been interested in for so long, literally years at this point. I read her short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from the Omelas, back in high school, and is genuinely one of the best pieces of writing I've ever read. And she just fascinates me as an author. By all accounts, she was ahead of her time, but also maybe even ahead of our modern sensibilities when it came to stuff like gender and capitalism. She was just so progressive. And so recently I finally got around to reading one of her novels. And I guess one of the questions I had before I read this book was, is it even worth it? Like in 2021, is there anything I can get out of reading this 60-year-old book? I think it came out in the 1960s, so that would make it a 60-year-old book at this point. So is there any point to reading A Wizard of Earthsea in this modern age? Hopefully this review will answer that question. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to leave a comment and like and subscribe and do all of those wonderful things. And so the first thing I wanted to address was the fact that I read this book as an audiobook, and I think that this is kind of the perfect way to experience this novel. One of the things that I noticed about the writing in A Wizard of Earthsea is that it's written in a way where it feels like you're being told a story, as opposed to a lot of other novels. I think a lot of modern novels in the fantasy genre tend to be more immersive, and the point is really to get the reader to feel like they're in this situation. And if that's what you're going for, ideally there wouldn't be any sort of separation between the reader and the character. You just feel like you're in the character's head and you're there doing the things with the character, or you are the character themselves. That's not the case in this book. There's a very distinct separation between the story, the reader, and the character. And honestly, I don't feel like there needs to be some sort of value assigned to that kind of writing. I think it's just sort of its own thing, and if you're in the mood for that, then you will love this book. If you're in the mood for something more immersive, I think that you probably should skip this book. But personally, like I said, I read this as an audiobook, and so the fact that it was written in a way where I think it was meant to mimic being told a story. There's a plane going by, so I'll wait. Almost from the beginning of this book, we're told that the main character, Ged, is going to go on to become a very famous and powerful wizard called Sparrowhawk. In a lot of ways, this book feels like Sparrowhawk's origin story, and it's basically just about him growing up in this very remote village in the mountains, and then going to magic school and going on a little quest. And in a lot of ways, it feels very familiar, but what I think is really impressive to me is that when Ursula K. Le Guin wrote this book, all of those things weren't necessarily familiar. She is kind of the one who pioneered the magic school genre. When she wrote A Wizard of Earthsea, that wasn't really a thing yet. And so even though this story kind of comes off very basic, I actually found it very insightful to read this as just a fantasy enthusiast, because I feel like you can really trace a lot of influences from Le Guin's work on other authors in this book. The magic school is a great example, and then certain story beats that happen at the magic school, you can just draw a direct line from Le Guin to authors like Patrick Rothfuss, Christopher Paolini. And that to me was probably the most gratifying part of reading A Wizard of Earthsea, was just being able to pick out specific influences that trickled down and really shaped fantasy as a genre. Figures like J.R.R. Tolkien get a lot of credit, and for good reason, but Le Guin doesn't get brought up nearly as much in those conversations, and I really feel like she should. I want to go back to her writing, because I know I said that there is a separation between the reader and the character, but I don't want that to sound like the writing is bad. There was some really beautiful writing in this book, specifically the nature and the way that Le Guin describes the mountains and the sea and the animals and just even the grass. Her description of grass is so beautiful and poetic. There's a part during the first third of the book where the main character and his mentor have to stop for the night, and they sleep under a tree while it's raining, and I just had to stop and read that part several times because it was so beautifully written. Yeah, the way that Le Guin describes this world is so gorgeous, and I felt like I just wanted to climb into this world and build myself a little cottage and just live in that cottage by myself. My biggest criticism for this book would definitely have to be the fact that there's this very apparent thread of internalized misogyny throughout the story, and it just pops up in really weird places in the fact that, you know, women's magic is characterized as being lesser or inferior to male magic, and also the fact that all of the people at the magic school that the main character goes to are all male. It didn't ruin the story for me, but it definitely took me out, and it definitely made the book feel a lot more dated. I think that if you cut those parts out, not only would you not lose anything of value to the story, but I think it would make the story feel a lot fresher and more timeless. It's obviously not the worst example of misogyny in fantasy, but it was just very jarring to see it from an author who is also a woman. I mentioned earlier that this story felt like it was an origin story, and in that regard, I really like how the central conflict of this book is basically Sparrowhawk versus himself. There are a lot of elements to this story that I feel will never go out of fashion. The main conflict in this book is really Sparrowhawk coming to terms with his identity and the darker parts of himself. And I think that that is just always going to be relevant, you know, recognizing the parts of you that you might not necessarily like or that scare you, in the way that we all have to grapple with that at some point in our lives. And so even though I don't think this book was perfect, I can see why it's heralded as such a classic and why people still read it even today. People will still be reading this book 50 years from now and still gleaning something important from it. And so yeah, all in all, I genuinely enjoyed this book so much. It definitely gave me a lot of insight into fantasy and the origins of fantasy as we know it today as a genre, and that was really what I was looking for when I went into this book, was context for modern fantasy. And so I definitely will be continuing on with the series. I've heard amazing things about Tomb of Atuan. Thank you so much for watching this review. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.